Welcome to the Self and Society podcast, exploring what it means to flourish as an individual and a community. This is your host, Ari Armstrong. Music by Jordan Smith, csclassical.com. Please join my email list for updates or help to support the show financially at ariarmstrong.com. Our guest today is Melvin Konner, author of Believers, Faith in Human Nature. Thanks a lot for being on the show today, Professor Konner.
Thanks so much for having me, Ari.
Yeah, it's a real honor. So I have a quick bio line, and then we'll get going. Melvin Konner is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and the program in Neuroscience and Behavioral Biology at Emory University in Atlanta. He earned his PhD in Biological Anthropology in 1973 and his MD in 1985, both from Harvard. He is the author of many books and articles, including The Tangled Wing, Women After All, Unsettled and Anthropology of the Jews, and The Paleolithic Prescription about diet. He has also been listed in Who's Who in Hell, so I guess I'll have good company down the line. So there's a line from your website that I really liked. It says, I apply science to human nature and experience, exploring the links between biology and behavior, medicine and society, nature and culture. I thought that was a nice summary.
Thank you.
So there's obviously a great deal we could cover today. I want to keep the discussion pretty tightly focused on the new book, Believers. Hopefully, toward the end, we'll have a few minutes you can at least tease some of your other major works for our listeners. We'll see how the time goes. But I thought it'd be interesting to start with some of your own biography, because some of that is directly relevant to the topic at hand, which is religious belief. And so I noticed in your book that you were raised in a religious household. So can you briefly describe what that was like and what the nature of what the religious feeling was like where you grew up?
Sure. It was a lower middle class, working class neighborhood in central Brooklyn. It was about a third Jewish, a third Irish American, a third Italian American. And so a lot of believing Jews and Catholics, and in my home, the belief was in what's called modern Orthodox Judaism, and my grandfather and grandmother lived with us until their death, his death when I was 8. Were the religious sort of beacons of the family, and we lived within walking distance of the synagogue because of my grandparents' beliefs. And my grandfather prayed in a ritual Jewish manner every morning. I remember watching him. I remember learning the letters of the Hebrew alphabet sitting in his lap from the Yiddish newspaper called the Forward. It's in Yiddish, and it's a little ironic because he was a small business owner, and the Forward is a kind of left-wing, even socialist newspaper, but the belief system was not socialism. The belief system in the family was Judaism, and I was in the synagogue every day from about age 7 when my grandfather made sure I was enrolled in the Hebrew school, and about age 16.
So is it something, do you feel like you just kind of fell into the religion, or is it something that you felt like you made some kind of conscious choice that this was for you? Or how did that
Well, you know, anthropologists say that the idea of religion as something separate from life is a relatively new one in history, and it's not that people don't distinguish between reality and in the usual material sense and the supernatural, but it's that they're people are sort of equally bathed in in both their material reality and their spiritual and religious beliefs, which are generally shared by those around them, and which they breathe in. I breathed it in with the air around me as I was growing up. So I can remember starting to think about choosing it when I was in my mid-teens, maybe, and realizing that I always realized it wasn't the only choice, but I thought it was the only choice for me because it was my parents' choice. My parents were handicapped. They were. My mother was deaf. My father was almost that, and so you might say that my grandparents had more of an influence on the choices in the household. But my mother was they were her parents, and my mother was very committed to following the rules of Judaism, both in the home and outside it, and bringing up her children Jewish.
Well, I guess my background is similar in some respects and very different in others. I grew up mostly in Western Colorado, and I grew up in a Protestant church. So similar to you, religion was all around me growing up. I went to church camp, went to Bible studies and youth groups and the whole works. So the particulars differed quite a bit, but still a strong background in religion. But it occurs to me that living in a sort of a multicultural environment, I guess growing up, we were at least aware that other people that we knew and were close with had very different religious ideas. So I had Catholic friends and Mormon friends and so on. And I'm sure there were many different. So I guess that's different from growing up in a society where there is one dominant religion that everybody embraces.
Well, like I say, the neighborhood was that part of Brooklyn was more than half Catholic. There were a lot of Catholic churches that I used to pass on the way to various places, and there was a certain amount of fear that we had as Jewish kids of the non-Jewish kids, the boys, and there were some bullying directed at us, but I would say, and I certainly was aware that they had different belief systems. It was just something that I didn't have to think about as an option. Certainly, I mean, they didn't want me, and I didn't want them. And our families were quite separate, and you would think that and I went to a public school. I was in the synagogue every day because the Hebrew school met every afternoon after school, and on Sundays, and there were services on Friday night and Saturday. But I was in public school with Catholic and other Christian kids, and the reality of differences was there. I would say that I took it for granted that when I was growing up that Judaism was superior, just as I'm sure my Christian friends grew up thinking the same about their upbringing. And it wasn't until I was maybe 15 or 14 or 15 when I started thinking, I have to actually think about why I believe these things, and I was starting to learn about evolution and to get interested in human origins. I was very interested in biology, like all Jewish boys in Brooklyn. I was expected to go to medical school, and I had to reconcile my scientific, growing scientific outlook with my very well established religious one, and eventually, my not just because of growing scientific knowledge, but because of a variety of life circumstances. When I started college, like a lot of kids I've seen and taught in half a century as a college teacher, I ended up losing my faith in that first semester. During that first semester in college, I started college young. I was only 17, and so there was an overlap between my childhood beliefs, partly because I continued to live at home. I went to Brooklyn College, a public institution that was. I could see the spire, the clock tower of one of the Brooklyn College buildings from my window where I slept as a child, and so I grew up in a kind of circumscribed and protected environment in some ways.
So it sounds like maybe this clash or conflict between your religious beliefs and your interest in evolutionary biology, is that part of what pushed you into the path of biological anthropology as opposed to being a medical doctor? I mean, you have your MD too, but as opposed to being a medical doctor primarily?
Yeah, well, I was I had the professional ambition of becoming a doctor, and it seemed like almost as natural as becoming a faithful Jew. But at the same time, I had a wonderful high school education, also public, but very good, and was greatly influenced by, in particular, by one teacher who had her 2 full years in world history and advanced placement world history, and there's a character in Joyce's novel Ulysses, I think it is, who says history is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake up, and that. I sort of had the feeling, especially growing up Jewish. I was born the year after the end of World War II, and my parents had claimed that they postponed my conception until after the war and after the closing of the gas chambers. Not that they had a lot to be afraid of in the United States, but there was certainly an atmosphere of almost grief in the community I grew up in the years immediately after World War II. Great consciousness of the damage that can be done by certain trends in history, and I already in my last year of high school, I remember I had formed the ambition to know as much as there was to know about the scientific basis of human nature. So I thought, well, there's also learning physics, and I learned that, how atoms and the elements of chemistry and molecules, the elements of biology, and I thought that since human beings are the elements of history, then understanding human nature would be a way of understanding history. I didn't realize at the time that wanting to know everything there was to know about the scientific basis of human nature was not a big ambition in 1963, because there just wasn't much that was known, and it wasn't even thought about much. These many years later, it's way too big a subject for any one person to master. But I'm very happy to have played my little role in and building up that knowledge and that perspective on human experience.
So sometime during your undergrad that you decided you wanted to switch gears and go into the more of the academic route?
Well, it was, I had my last year in college, I had the medical school applications on my desk, and I didn't fill them out, and I applied to graduate school in biological anthropology instead. I mean, one of the reasons was I was very involved in the left-wing movements of the 60s. I and the integration movement, the anti-war movement, even as a high school student, and I actually was present at the I Have a Dream speech that occurred 2 days before my 17th birthday, and I defied my parents' wishes to get on a bus in the middle of the night, go to Washington, and and that set of experiences was also an important new window on life for me, and a challenge to my faith, mainly because there wasn't, although I absolutely revered my rabbi, I didn't see him stepping up to address the ethical challenges of nuclear bombs and the integration movement, and then eventually the growing war in Vietnam. And so I was raised with a certain ethical viewpoint, partly by Jewish authorities who aren't always. Some did, but most were not paying much attention to what I consider the big wrongs of the era that I and my friends were trying to do something to correct. So there was that. There was an unrequited love. There was a philosophy teacher who challenged my beliefs, and the upshot of all of it was that by the time I was in the middle of my first year of college, I was sort of leaning toward anthropology but as a new way of exploring human origins, also as a way of understanding what I ended up writing about in this book more than half a century later, namely the tremendous variety of religious beliefs, which obviously to a thinking person has to be in some way a challenge to their own most cherished parochial beliefs, and it was eventually how I experienced it. So I wanted to understand the cross-cultural manifestations of human nature and culture in particular cultures, and part of that was the origins of faith and the origins and diversity of religious belief.
Well, that kind of brings us to your experiences in Botswana. That's the country where it was, right? With the
Right.
Kung people. And so was that during graduate school, or was that after your graduate school degree?
That was my doctoral thesis, and it was so I spent almost 2 years there working on my doctoral research after several years in graduate school, and completed my thesis and began teaching, and went back there for 6 months with my wife, who was also a budding anthropologist, although self-taught, and so that was a great formative experience for me.
Well, one thing you talk about in the book are these trance dances that they did. and your participation in those and some of the supernatural beliefs that were related to those dances. So, you want to give us the thumbnail version of what that was about and what that was like to participate in that?
Sure, I can try. People don't have a set time when they do this, and traditionally, it might be a couple of times a week, probably at most. It's very energy consuming. People either get excited about an antelope that's been killed, or they have a sick person in the community that they want to heal, or it might be just the moon is particularly bright, and usually women who will start by sitting around the fire and clapping and singing, and the singing has this very yodely quality. I don't know if your system permits this, but I have recordings on iTunes that I could play if you want to get a little clip.
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to do a show page for this. So if you have links and such, if there's some kind of link to it, send me that in an email and I'll definitely drop that in. I also saw a video, not of you, but just, I don't know who it was, on YouTube of some of these dances. So I understand this kind of yodeling type of style of singing.
Right.
So I'll drop that in too. Just, I don't know if it's the same. I assume it's similar at least to what you experienced.
Well, if you can send me that link, I can tell you whether I think it's legit. There are perfectly good things that are acceptable, that are accessible on the web, and that I had nothing to do with. So it's likely that what you saw was real. But so there is this almost psychedelic quality to the singing, and then men will start to come out and have dance rattles on their ankles and start dancing, and they start dancing in a circle around the women's circle, and then people may, if it goes on, it sort of has to, it has to catch fire, you might say. People have to click, and it's interesting that if it's really a very communal activity, and it's interesting that if it doesn't work, and sort of peters out early, people start pointing fingers. The women will say the men weren't dancing, they weren't going into trance. The men will say the women weren't singing well enough to. And there is an option for women to be trance healers also, but in this particular ceremony, which is pretty central, it's usually men. Men may use plants that they say have hallucinogenic properties only when they're in training, and they eventually get to a point where they can go into trance by this very vigorous dancing and staring into the fire, inhaling smoke, but I often say that the more fancy the dance, the less likely the man is to go into trance, and the dances that men do who are powerful healers are actually very monotonous, and they're just pounding their heels on the ground over and over again for hours, and it's kind of like delivering a little blow to the base of your skull. And incessantly for hour after hour, but it's also in order to just like with the advanced yogis, with people who go into speaking in tongues in certain Christian branches. people who go into altered states, or even just prayerful altered states, there has to be a belief system. There has to be a framework that tells you why you're doing this and why it's not only okay but a good thing to basically lose control of your usual mental processes. And they believe, the Kung believed that the advanced trancers leave their bodies during trance, and they have to and they have the opportunity to travel to what they call the village of the spirits, Awasichuko, and they will do various things. They'll try and glean information about why someone is sick, because they're always blaming the spirits of the ancestors and the gods for illness and injury. And in fact, in this, so the Trance Dance Circle is a circle of women singing and clapping. There's the circle of men dancing, and then there's a circle of spectators, which might include teenagers and older people who are not trancers, and then so they're observers, and they also get healed during the laying on of hands when the healer goes into trance. But in addition, there's fourth circle, which they say is where the ancestors and spirits come and sit and watch. And there are moments in the ceremony, and it's I mean, to call it a ceremony, I mean, one shouldn't think of something with very strict protocol. But it's definitely a ceremony. And then there are points when the man in trance will stop and point his finger at the fourth circle and start yelling at the spirit. So there's not the kind of reverence that for God that I was raised with, and that I'm guessing you as a Christian child were raised with. There's an expression. There's a much more mixed kind of set of feelings. They think the gods and spirits are powerful, but they think they're more malign than generous and beneficent, and they don't thank them very much. They kind of yell at them. And this is one of the things. I mean, there is a tradition in Judaism of arguing with God, which I think is partaking of that same quality of non-reverential questioning, even while believing very sincerely in these supernatural powers and authorities. But I mean, I knew by the time I saw this trance dance, I knew that there was a lot more to religion than what I was brought up with. There was a lot more to it than what I and my Catholic schoolmates were brought up with. It was before a major influx of Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist believers into the United States. But that was on the verge of happening, and certainly as an anthropology, as a young anthropologist, I was totally aware not only of those major religions, but also literally thousands of minor religions, like the one I experienced directly in Africa. And when I came to think about what religion is, and how to use the facts of the scientific basis of human nature to help account for it, there's a lot to account for. It's not just the Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic faiths. It's Buddhism, where there's no God, at least theoretically. It's Hinduism, where there's up to hundreds of gods. at least for some people. There are religions like the Cone I lived with, people who are not reverential toward their gods, but actually angry and trying to get their gods to do the right thing, but rather than begging them to do the right thing or assuming that whatever they do is right. And then there are the things that all religions have in common. But as I approached this book, I wanted that entire panorama of different kinds of religious and faith commitments to be in front of me. And I made a little Post-it note when I first started out the project, and it was on my desktop, and I have it in front of me still, and it says awe, sacred and profane, fear, spirituality, ritual, rites of passage, taboo, purity and danger, belief, explanation, narrative, origins, altered states, out-of-body experience, near-death experience, mysticism, morals, prayer, peak experience, flow, attachment, communion, love, group identity, xenophobia. All that was what I thought of in a short time as part of what you need to be thinking about explaining if you're trying to explain religion. And that's only a fraction of the different possibilities.
Well, that's why I think your book is really valuable, because whether or not a reader agrees with some of your interpretations and theses, just the amount of information about different religions is really interesting in some of the studies, all the various studies, with whether it's looking at people's brainwaves or looking at how faith impacts their practices or healing. That's all just fascinating. But listening to your description of these trance dances, I just was imagining how overwhelmingly psychologically these must have been for the kids watching. It just must have been really powerful and impactful to imagine these spirits around you that are interfering with your life, or somehow engaging with your life. I guess our parallel in my tradition would be we didn't go for the arguing with God bit, but we would certainly be angry at the devils and such, which my church, those were very real. Satan and his minions were real forces in the world, we thought. So I guess that would be my closest parallel.
Yeah, well, most religions have either have some sort of dark figures in their pantheon, like Satan, or they have a dark side of God, and Jewish mysticism says that although most attributes of God are good and admirable and magnificent, there is a dark side that can be triggered, that can help explain, at least for Jewish mystics and some other Orthodox Jews, that can help explain the terrible things that can happen in life and the world.
Yeah, well, that's totally alien to the way I was brought up. So we have different ways of dealing with evil in the world. But I wanted to hit one more note of biography before we get more deeply into the book, and that's how you ended up at Emory University in the midst of getting your MD. So you went back to school, back to Harvard, and I think you got your MD in 1985. But during this same period, in the early to mid 80s, you were beginning a career in anthropology at Emory. So how did you do that?
Yeah, how did that
Like
happen? Right,
really difficult.
So, well, one thing I can assure you of, and any young people who might be listening, please take note that it was completely unplanned, and my life took the course it took through some amount of ambition and planning in certain directions, but also a tremendous amount of luck to go back to how I got to Emory and how I got to medical school. I taught at Harvard for 5 years or so, or 6, and never got over wanting to become a doctor. Like most Harvard junior faculty in that era, it's not today. I didn't have a long-term future on the Harvard faculty, and the prospect of medical school started to look like something that would, first of all, give me a really great education in basic human biology. Second, a lot of experiences that would help me in my quest to understand human nature. But at the time that I started medical school, I was planning to. It wasn't just as an intellectual exercise. I wasn't even planning to write a book about it, which I ended up doing. I was going to try to become a practicing doctor, having something to do with the brain, either in neurology or biological psychiatry. But I thought I would probably end up in academic medicine and try to keep some ties to medical anthropology. I was in my second year, I guess, of medical school, and I got I was in 1982. I got a letter from somebody at Emory, which I had never heard of. I had heard of Atlanta, and driven through it once, but it said, we are looking. We're starting an anthropology department and looking for somebody to be the first chair, and we'd like you to apply. And my wife and I, looked at it and had a good laugh over it. I mean, and it just didn't make any sense. I probably should have been more polite, but the phone rang, and before cell phones, my landline rang in our kitchen, and we already had our second child. It was a baby then, and I was in medical school, and when I say there's a lot of luck, I didn't always pick up the phone in those days, but I did, and my now good friend Peter Brown, who's still was about to retire from the Emory faculty, was on the other end and said, "Did you get our letter?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm sorry I didn't answer it." He said, "Well, we were hoping you would apply. Tomorrow's the deadline." I said, "Are you aware that I am a medical student?" There was a long pause, and he finally said, "That's very interesting." And the reason he thought it was interesting was he was also a medical anthropologist. They wanted to have stronger ties to the medical school, which is on the campus, right next to the campus here. Not true everywhere. It wasn't true at Harvard, and it makes a difference to the amount of exchange between a medical center and a university if they're physically close. And they also wanted better ties to the CDC. They were planning to start a school of public health, and anyway, one thing led to another. I went down for a visit. I went down for a second visit. I said, "Look, I am not going to do this right away because I'm going to finish medical school," and they accepted that, and that's how those different dates appear in the different biographies that you found. In 82, in the late spring of 82, I said, "Yes, I'll come to Emory after I go back and do my third year of medical school." And then I sort of was going back and forth. I moved to Atlanta in 83, but I also went back and did some of my last clinical rotations here in Atlanta, and got my MD from Harvard. And at the time, I was still hoping to find some way to continue to keep a hand in medicine, as they say. But not long after that, my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, and everything changed. So I ended up being an intellectual and professor by career, and again, and I did have the opportunity to teach some medical students to help with some of those ties to public health, the CDC, and the medical school over the years, and I've also taught probably thousands of pre-medical and pre-nursing and other pre-health students. And naturally, a lot of them come to me for advice about medical school.
That's quite a story. It's almost as though the hand of God guided you.
Well, the religious person in my shoes would probably say exactly that. I just say I had some ambition, some talent, some some luck, maybe a lot of luck, and I had to be. My life wouldn't have worked if I hadn't been open to a lot of unplanned circumstances, both positive and negative, and but certainly that curiosity about human nature that I had established in my last year of high school when I was doing AP World History and also a lot of science and biology. And eventually ended up with anthropology as a sort of compromise. But the goal that I had then I was very strongly motivated to really understand people in a fundamental way, and also in a broad way that included everything from genes and evolution to culture and psychology. The experiences I had in Africa, obviously, were tremendously valuable exposure to the range of humanity and human experience. Also, because this was a hunting and gathering society, there was a sense that this was something like some of the environments that we evolved in as hunter-gatherers in the past. And then when I went to medical school and had clinical rotations, I delivered 36 babies. I saw people in mental breakdowns, people with dementia, and other neurological disorders, and just understanding people facing death. Sometimes bravely, sometimes not. And just the power of biology over the human mind and over human life became apparent to me in a different way. So, I can't even say, Ari, how I put this all together. But over the years, I have tried to do that, and I always take an eclectic approach. Some people think I'm a mile wide and an inch deep, and I try to think of it as reaching out to different fields and trying to go more than an inch deep into each one of them. And I see, and I've seen in my career, a huge amount of parochialism in academia, a huge amount of commitment to one approach to human nature, human behavior, one of the reasons I chose anthropology is that it seemed like the most eclectic approach, and it seemed like the one most open to other disciplines like biology and psychology and medicine and history. So,
Well, it seemed to work out great, so I'm glad you went that route. And
well, thank you.
From as far as I'm concerned, that's the kind of approach that appeals to me, that seems most likely to yield the most insignificant insights about the human condition, which is complicated after all.
Yes.
So
I can agree with that, Ari.
So I kind of wanted to start to dig a little bit deeper into the book and the substance of the book. And I thought I would just start by trying to pitch you what I think, my summary of your thesis, and then you can tell me if I'm right or wrong or complete or incomplete. So here's how I wrote the synopsis. Many or most people are physiologically predisposed to experience religious rituals as meaningful and to hold supernatural beliefs. And religion offers real value to many people and positively affects their lives. That to me seemed to encompass what you were about. Is that how you would put it?
Yeah, I think so. You were alluding earlier. You asked a question I didn't quite answer, which what must it have been like for the children of the Kong Bushmen, they're sometimes called, to be growing up and being immersed in these trance dances. I didn't mention that women always have the babies and small children in their lap or in the sling on their side or back while they're sitting in the middle of the trance dance and singing and doing this syncopated clapping. It's very complicated, and so children are really immersed, and that immersion is not going to affect every child equally. And there are people in that culture, just like in Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism, any other religion, who become devout for one reason or another, and people who kind of can take it or leave it, and I think that's been true in every culture and every faith tradition since the beginning of religion, and I think we know now why that is. There are individual variations in susceptibility to faith and religious devotion, which are heritable, and they're not. It's not that you inherit the propensity to be Hindu or Jewish. It's that within whatever religious tradition you're immersed, you have a greater or lesser inclination to see beyond the material world, and I think the one thing that I used in the book as a definition that I think applies very broadly, although it's a Christian statement from the letter to the Hebrews. It's the conviction of things unseen. It's a belief in things hoped for, I think, is the way it goes. And depending on the translation, the conviction of things unseen, and that's something that some people are more susceptible to than others, and some people are susceptible to it at one part of their lives, like I was until I was 17, and then not, or less so. But there's no doubt that, just as there's no doubt that the critics of religion are right when they point to the bad and evil consequences of religion and religious belief. We see it on the news all the time, and the way it can divide people, and the way it can even promote violence, and part of the nightmare of human history has been. I don't know if I want to say because of, but it certainly has involved different religious traditions clashing with each other at the tremendous human cost. those are all bad things. But as I often say to the what I think of as the aggressive atheists, if you want to take a scientific approach, and some of them are very good scientists, if you want to take a scientific approach to the question of what is the impact of religion on human life, and also, they're serious about trying to abolish it, and what would happen if it were abolished? That's partly an empirical. It is an empirical question, I would say. It's just, what would happen if religion was abolished? It really depends on what you think religion is doing in the world. And if you wanted to know that as a scientist, you would, you'd open up your digital document and you'd make two columns, and one would be bad done by religion, and the other would be good done by religion, and you wouldn't have exact measurements or a science like laboratory chemistry or even laboratory psychology, but you would at least be taking into account both things on both sides of the ledger, and they don't do that. They just have one column, which is evil done by religion, how religion misleads people, how religion creates fairy tales instead of acceptance of science, how religion pits people against each other, how religion sends young people to go and blow themselves up to make a religious point. Sure, there's all that, but there's also growing evidence that not only do most religious people not do those kind of things, but they take comfort in their beliefs. They are very often, there's growing evidence that they're often better off when they get sick in any number of different diseases. If they're religious, they take better care of themselves. They're more likely to live longer with kidney dialysis. There was a Saudi Arabian study with Muslims, and they're more likely to live to avoid the stressful effects of racism if they're middle-aged Black people in the U.S. and there are many other studies that I talk about in my chapter about this, and the other question is, does religion figure in altruism? And what the aggressive atheists always tell everyone is, look at Bertrand Russell, look at Albert Einstein, look at all the people who have been tremendously ethical atheists. And I mean, who anybody who knows anything will not try to challenge that statement. Of course, it's possible to be a very good person and an atheist. It's possible to be very altruistic and an atheist. But there's still a question of whether religious faith figures into some people's altruism and some people's willingness to cooperate or sacrifice for others. There are a number of studies now showing that the great majority of, let's say 70% or so of doctors, practicing doctors, say that they believe in God in the Western tradition. And it's higher with nurses and some other kinds of health professionals. Studies show that people will, in certain economic games, will be more generous if, in a market setting, let's say in a Muslim country, they'll be more generous to others in the game when the call to prayer is being sounded than at other times. People will be more generous in a Christian country on Christian holidays than other days. And there are lots of other examples. You don't have to be religious to be a good person, but for many people, they're sort of part being good and being faithful, or sort of part and parcel of each other.
Well, there's a whole lot of interest in what you just said. And I tend to be pretty sympathetic to the new atheists, but I think that you make a very fair point. It's like, yeah, you have to evaluate the good and the bad of religion. Anything, if you only look at the negative side, of course, you think it's a bad deal. So I think
Right.
that makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate that sort of pushback. I was curious. I wanted to go back to the Botswana for just a minute, based on something you said. I was wondering if any of the youth there approached you and tried to get a sense of what your life was like outside, in your home, where you lived, and what life was like in the West, and if any of them seemed open to considering that as a, like maybe leaving their community, or would that have been just totally alien and unnatural for them to even consider that?
Well, leaving your community, I mean, their idea of a really bold move is to get married to someone who's in a band on the other side of the next hill, and move 10 miles away, and hear slightly different accent in people's voices. The people have always moved, but they've generally moved as groups, and they haven't always moved as much in history as we do now, especially across cultural boundaries. I have to say that in the first two trips that I was there were incipient indications of change, but they were, young people, as you say, and some older people were dazzled by automobiles and pressure lamps. Like a Coleman pressure lamp, where you used to push the button over and over again. It would build up pressure in the butane or whatever it is in the base of the lamp, and then you take a match, push a button, and there would be almost an explosion of very bright light, and the mantle would be lit and not burning, not being consumed. And this is a pretty elementary piece of camping equipment, but I remember this guy who was a friend of ours, who is maybe 50 years old at the time, who just saw this. He wasn't seeing it for the first time, but he was kind of thinking about it, and he just shook his head back and forth and he said, "You people are gods." And there's that feeling, that Western people had magic. But when they actually started to change their culture, which they by now have, and I went back in 2005, a couple of my grown kids, and saw a lot of change. But what they were changing to, what they were assimilating to, was the neighboring cattle herding and farming people's customs and practices, not jumping, like wanting to jump over the ocean to something European or American, and so that's a sort of intrinsic, gradual change that anthropologists are very familiar with. I would say also that they showed remarkably little curiosity about us, my wife and I, and other anthropologists there at various different times, considering how utterly curious we were about them. I think, well, for one thing, how curious would most Americans be about them? probably not very, and probably wouldn't want to visit there or stay there for more than a few days. But they were they thought it made a lot of sense for us to be fascinated by them, and because they considered themselves fascinating. And that's how it. Of course, you're interested in what we do. Of course, you write down what we do. You're not gonna all those little pieces of paper you write down stuff on. You're not gonna throw them away. You're gonna go back to your own village and sell them, which is not too far from the truth.
Right.
And but at the same time, I think they appreciated that we were kind of telling their story to the world. And I think it may, some anthropologists, not I, but some of the anthropologists who've studied them have become tremendously committed to helping protect them, and as they go through the inevitable changes of the 21st century, but for me it was a very important mission to learn about them and tell others about them, and maybe do it in a way that would have some influence on the way people think and act, and certainly, but in the way people conceptualize human behavior when you include such different culture.
Well, I think I think Richard Dawkins is a big fan of religious studies in the sense of making people aware of the variety of religious experience. So yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me, and I think people should learn more about that kind of stuff. But speaking of Dawkins, let's jump back to the New Atheist for a minute. So Dawkins has been really influential in my thinking, and I think Sam Harris is doing really great work in general. So here's how. So I don't want to try to speak for them, but here's how I would try to give the atheist pushback to what you're saying in your book. The first note is that these atheists are more concerned not with the ritualistic aspect of religion, but simply with whether the religious claims, like the metaphysical claims, are true or false. Like, was Jesus really born from a virgin? Insofar as they're making claims about the world, they are valuable. And then the next point that I think is most important, maybe, is that I don't think any new atheist would say, well, look, it would be. I mean, I know you've talked about if you could push the button or pull the lever or whatever and just end religion. Actually, I don't know what they would say, but obviously it's impossible. So I think what they say is that it's possible for people to slowly adapt and adopt good substitutes for the aspects of religion that are meaningful and important. So, for example, you get people promoting secular humanism. I heard you on with Michael Shermer, and he's likes to talk about that a lot. And Sam Harris has his book, Waking Up, which is about how people can sort of co-opt Buddhist practices for a secular lifestyle. So what do you I mean, are you and they just speaking across each other to a certain degree, or how do you respond to those sorts of atheistic concerns?
Well, I don't think that Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or Dan Dennett are going to take somebody like me very seriously, but I certainly take them seriously. And first of all, I think before Dawkins got interested in attacking religion, he was already one of the great evolutionary thinkers of his generation, and someone who was able to communicate evolutionary science in a way that few other people have ever done. And Harris, although he started his career with the End of Faith and Letter to a Christian Nation, he later became a neuroscientist and has done very interesting work. So these are people that I can admire, at least for a number of things that they've done. I also admire the way Christopher Hitchens was not a scientist, but it was definitely an aggressive atheist. The way he faced cancer and ultimately left this world. I mean, not only did he die without knuckling under, as W.C. Fields said about his own atheism, or predicted, but he I think he was very courageous in the way he faced death, and just as it's true that atheists can be wonderful people, they can also be people who face death with aplomb, and it's not true that there are no atheists in foxholes. But that's so the good. Let me get back to the question you raised about their idea that it won't be a magic wand that makes religion disappear, but gradually people will give it up. And I think that there's a lot of support for the claim up to a point. The people of Western Europe, the people of China, and now to an important extent, the people of the United States are turning away from conventional religion, and they're doing very well, thank you, without conventional religion in quite large numbers. But there are several arguments I see for it not getting to zero or anything like zero in terms of the number of people who believe in things unseen in one way or another. First of all, there are genetic differences, and one of the reasons that Sam Harris is who he is and that Richard Dawkins is who he is that they're missing. I don't want to say missing. They have a different set of genes governing their attitude toward the unseen than religious people do. And one of the reasons I thought I could do something useful in this book was that I've been on the other side. So maybe I was somewhere in between in my genetic tendency. And as a child, adolescent, I stuck with the faith I was raised in, and then adapted in the sense that you propose can happen, and a lot of people have done that, but not everyone, and not yet a majority, even in the countries where this trend has gone quite far. The countries where atheism is very is at a very high level now, like Scandinavia, Britain, Germany, and so on. You have not a majority who say there's nothing supernatural. You might have a third or so who say that, and maybe and it's different in different countries. I'm just trying to ballpark the thing here. Maybe a third who continue with some form of conventional religion, and then you have this group of people who say, no, I don't believe in the conventional religion, and I don't believe that Jesus rose from the grave after being dead for 3 days, and I don't believe that Moses received the law from God on Mount Sinai, but who say, but I don't think that the world is completely material. I don't need to have scientific evidence for everything I believe. And those people tend to call themselves spiritual. They might be interested in crystals, or they might be praying privately, or they might be meditating, or they might be adopting some Buddhist practices like Sam Harris recommends, although he does it in a more secular way. Or they might just declare that there has to be something more in the world than what science can detect and prove. I think that you could have a lot of people giving up. You could have a majority of people eventually giving up conventional religions, even while some people cling to them, and other people are in this middle ground of self-declared spirituality, where they can't. They're not interested in the kind of rigorously scientific and materialistic or material world outlook that someone like Dawkins or Dennett or Harris insist on. So then to just go back to the question of genetic differences, if I think it's difficult to challenge the idea that there are these genetic influences on how susceptible people are to religious faith, or call it indoctrination if you want. Although it's hard to explain if it's all indoctrination. It's hard to explain why some people are more religious than their parents were when they were growing up. But there are differences in these inclinations, and in every country, in every major religion, at least, we have evidence that the most religious people have the most children. So if you put that together with the fact that there's partially genetic influence, and you have two opposing trends going on in the world now. I think you have the one that the aggressive atheists are pointing to and trying to accelerate, of a sort of a cultural evolution away from conventional faith, and at the same time you have the most devoted and religious people in every country having the most children. So, the long-term outcome is not 100% clear, but I think, I guess what I predict in the book is an equilibrium of some kind. Eventually, that might look like the way northwestern Europe looks now. I don't think the United States will be as religious as it has been in the past, except for the fact that immigrants are more religious than natives, and if that continues, and the United States continues to import, religious Catholics from south of the border, and religious Muslims and Hindus from Asia, and those people continue to have larger families than us non-believers, and you can pretty much be assured that there's going to be a limit to the disappearance of religiosity in America and the world, of course. And of course, the people south of the equator right now are nothing like the people of Europe or China, even in their level of religiosity. They're much more religious than
Well, it seems
We are.
obvious. Right, right.
Okay.
It seems obvious that genetics plays a role in individual propensities to, embrace religion and do a number of other things. But I'm wondering if there's a certain tension in your thinking along these lines. So I was listening to a podcast with you and a woman named Krista Tippett, and she credited you with this line: "The moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but we have to keep doing the bending." So on one hand, you put a heavy emphasis on our evolved nature, and yet you are also arguing that we can overcome some of our negative impulses. So in terms of, I think you talk about male propensity to violence. So certainly there are things we can do to sort of counteract some of the things our genes are saddling us with. And I don't know. Do you see a tension there, or how do you balance those things between our dispositions and what we should be doing insofar as we can counteract certain genetic dispositions?
That's a very good question. I had my last book was about sex differences. It was called Women After All: Sex Evolution and the End of Male Supremacy. And when I think about physical violence, when I think about exploitative sexuality, both of which are really overwhelmingly male inclinations and actions. I can say unequivocally that I'd like to see the human species overcome those, preferably without eliminating males, but with a series of historical and cultural changes that empower women more, and that make it less likely for men to resort to those inclinations, and also women have, men and women both have inclinations toward greed and other kinds of exploitation, so how do I I think what you're asking with the moral arc question, and really it's something that Obama quoted from Martin Luther King, but King was not the first to say it, but he did say that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And when Obama quoted that in an important speech, he said he followed it by saying, "But it doesn't bend on its own." And I certainly don't think Dr. King would have disagreed with that, because he spent his life trying to bend it faster and more. And the only reason, well, I won't say the only reason, one of the main reasons that it bends is that we consciously decide to struggle against some of our tendencies that our better judgment tells us to reprehend. But for religious people, that's always in the context of their relationship with the supernatural. Either God gives you a set of principles that you follow directly or indirectly, or in the case of Buddhism, there's karma, a karmic cycle in the universe that you can get in sync with more or less, and it depends on for Tibetan Buddhists, it depends on compassion, so those are the people who for whom becoming better as individuals, and hopefully as a society and as a species, is tied up with supernatural beliefs. For someone like me, it's not. It's consciousness of our origins. It's understanding as much as possible about human nature. It's not being naive about our inclinations, and it also involves a commitment to trying to be better and to make the world a better place as we see it. And I think that for reasons we don't have time to go into, there's a lot of merit in the things that people like Dawkins say about the evolution of ethical norms and behaviors being, at least to some extent, independent of religious belief, and certainly for somebody like me, it's not dependent on revelation or sacred texts. It's something that people figured out, and I happen to think that people figured it out in a way that was very intertwined with religious faith for almost all of human history. And now, I don't totally disagree with them. There does seem to be a decoupling going on, and I'm not really worried about that. It's I still don't know what the consequences ultimately would be of eliminating religion, but I'll tell you where I really part company with them is that by pointing out the mistakes that religions have made in terms of a scientific worldview, that they're going to convince people to abandon religion. I mean, they will convince people who have less of that natural inclination toward faith. But in some ways, I think they're very naive about religion and faith, because despite Dawkins' declared interest in different religions and Harris's interest in Buddhism, I mean, like most American Western Buddhists, secular Buddhists, they're not interested in the aspects of Buddhism that Buddhists consider fundamental, and so they pick and choose what they like, and the idea that a number of them have, and you can read it in their writings, that here I'm going to explain to you why you're wrong, why it's not possible that Jesus came back from the dead, why it's not possible that some teensy particle of your being is going to exist after your death and enter another living thing, and that's going to go on forever. Why it's not possible for the Hebrews to have crossed the Red Sea on dry land. Whatever beliefs that aren't consistent with science, and that you and I and Richard and Sam might agree have no basis in fact. You don't get anywhere by just telling people that they have no basis in fact. And they, nine times out of 10, or maybe not that much, but the great majority of people know that they have no basis in fact. There's never been a religion that did not recognize that it was full of expensive commitments to things unseen and things unprovable. I mean, the religious people I grew up with would not be interested in proving that God exists, or proving that the ethical principles that they followed in their lives and the rituals that they followed in their lives is something that God wants them to do. Christians in the church I go to with my wife at Easter time, which I find a very moving service. They're not interested in somebody telling them that Jesus can't have come back from the grave. In that modern church, probably. I don't know what the kind of church you grew up in, Ari, but you have probably a broad range of beliefs about that in a congregation that's listening to a sermon about the resurrection. But people are there because they're moved by the story, and some people are there because they absolutely believe it happened. And well, why did they believe it happened? Well, because 3 women saw Jesus after he was killed, and 3 days later he appeared to them, and that's evidence enough for me. Well, it's not evidence enough for scientists, but not everything that people believe has to be scientifically provable. That's how I look at it. Yeah, go ahead.
Part of my tradition was more literalist, and so more fundamentalist in certain respects. So the truth of the propositions mattered a great deal, and our salvation depended on it. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things that I've gotten reading your book, is that that's not the way that religion works for a lot of people. And I think the new atheists, in a way, I think you make this point actually. The new atheists share something with the fundamentalists in that they want to interpret Scripture in a literalist way. And a lot of religious people it's like you're talking past them. It's not even what they're interested in. So I think that point is a good one and well taken. And man, I tell you what, we've been going almost an hour and a half, and there's a whole lot of strings that I have not pulled on, and I've got through about half my notes. But well, I think we've covered a lot of ground and at least given people a good sense of what your book is about.
Well, I think you have to. I would just call your attention to something relevant to what you were saying a few minutes ago. It's this idea put forward. I talk about in the book. Put forward and studied by the psychologist Christine Lagarde, and it's the idea of coexistence reasoning. And she finds that in a number of different cultures, people grow up with sort of compartments in their minds, one of which is for the material world and scientifically provable facts, and the other of which is for things unseen or for the convictions that can't be proved. And those, for most people, I mean, you're saying that you grew up in a literalist, fundamentalist stream of Christianity, where it was the commitment to the real supernatural events is very important. That's true for some branches of all religions, and then you have churches and synagogues and mosques and temples where some of the people who show up, especially for major holidays, are true believers, and some are not. And some have this coexistence reasoning, which is, well, I know that when I'm sick, I have to think about doing what the doctor tells me to do. I have to eat right. I have to sleep right. I have to do things that are proven valuable. But I also want to pray, or I also want to meditate, or I also want to bring a bowl of rice to the statue of Buddha in my house, or to the ancestors. And they don't have to. Their minds don't explode because they're able to think on these two different tracks. that's what coexistence reasoning is, and lots and lots and lots of people can do it and do it all the time.
Yeah, that's what I was never comfortable with. So that's why I tend to side with the new atheists. I mean, I find their approach resonates with me in a certain way. But so yeah, I appreciate this other side of religion that maybe that's something that I wasn't exposed to as much, even though I was very religious. Well, I think we're gonna wrap up. The book is Believers, Faith in Human Nature. And you have your website is at melvinkonner.com.
Correct.
There's a lot of great stuff on there, including some stuff about some work that
Thank
your
you.
current wife is doing, which is fascinating, and I wish we had time to talk about that. There's also a web page about your work, including your CV at Emory, which is a very extensive CV. Is there any other obvious way to track your work besides what I mentioned?
Well, I have a Twitter feed. I'm not the most active user, but I'm moderately active, I would say. On Twitter, it's at Tangled Wing, which was the name of my first book. But you can look up Mel Konner and find me. Yes, I actually also have another website that you might not have run across called JewsandOthers.com, which is where I've spent some time musing on my Jewish background and my and some aspects of Jewish history and culture, and how Jews fit into the rest of the world. That's why it's called Jews and Others. I like to think that my Jewish identity is real, but not parochial, if that makes any sense.
Well, I'll check that out and start reading that, and I'll definitely drop that in the show notes too.
Okay, great. And if you find that when you're editing this, there's something you want to get that we didn't get, feel free to set up another session, and however brief, I'll be glad to.
Oh, well, if I did that, I might want to do a whole new session.
Okay. Well, yeah, resist the temptation for now, but feel free to take an interest in anything else that I am interested in.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, the Tangled Wing looks really fascinating, even though the second edition is 2002, so it's a few years out now, right. But it still looks like kind of your fundamental work.
Yes, I'm worried about it getting long in the tooth, but it took I don't know, about 4 years to revise the 1982 edition and make the really different 2002 edition. I'm not sure if that's the way I want to use another 4 years to bring that up to date, but it is it's fundamentally a statement about how it's possible to understand human nature from a scientific viewpoint, and it's in a way it's paralleled by Believers, except it's much less specific, and there's not much about religion in it, but it's about fundamental human inclinations, both positive and negative, and
well, maybe you could do an article just saying, if I were to update it, here's the sorts of things I would try to look at, just to kind of give people who read it kind of a hint as to what they would need to look at also to get it updated.
I like that idea. Now I just have to find somebody else who likes it. Somebody with a with a printing press, or at least a website that other people read. No, that is a nice idea. So listen, Ari, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure you need to get on with other things. But but I appreciate your doing this very much, and I'll look forward to seeing what comes out of it. Thank you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for doing it. This has been the Self and Society podcast. I'm the host, Ari Armstrong. Our guest has been Melvin Konner, author of Believers. For more, please see ariarmstrong.com.